So as we move to the subject of gender and the role that it plays in all systems and all paradigms, economic, social, cultural, political, we are compelled to look at this inequality through a gender lens because the differences are profound and holding many millions from reaching their potential, which according to the International Monetary Fund would add at least 30% to the global GDP. So it makes economic sense to bridge the barriers for women and to others whose voices are often not represented in the places where decisions, economic, political, cultural, and the real shifts are made. Our special guest this evening knows a lot about voice and a lot about gender. She wrote first about the importance of having a voice in all places, public and private. She wrote about the challenges for women and girls to find their voices and to keep them in a seminal book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, which caused a sensation in the 70s, including in my life. Harvard Press called it the little book that started a revolution. And she's back, fueling another seismic shift with her current book titled, Why Does Patriarchy Exist? That's a loaded word. And who better to help us understand it and what it means in the context of Acumen's work than the author, Carol Gilligan. Time magazine called Carol one of the most, I think one of the 25 most influential Americans. And I love that I have this opportunity to acknowledge what an influence you were in my life. And I suspect, I could tell by the smiles on many faces and the lives of many others in this room who read that book in the 70s and realized how important it was to find our voices. Women and others who were being left out or who were not speaking up. So let's begin there, since so much of your work has been about gender and about the importance of women finding and sustaining their voices. Let's start our talk there with why voice matters so much.
You know, I will always remember there was when I was at Harvard, which I was for many years teaching, and the students wanted to bring faculty who differed together to talk. And so they brought a colleague of mine and myself on stage, and all the students wanted to see what would happen. And I would say voice, meaning voice. I mean, we all have a voice. You know,
except we're having trouble hearing yours.
Oh, okay. No, and in fact, we're born with a voice. I mean, even before we have language. As human beings, we're born with a voice, meaning we are able to communicate our experience to other people. I mean, just think about a baby. I mean, how amazingly a baby can communicate. If it's uncomfortable, if it's, if it's happy and so forth. So we all have a voice and the ability to communicate with one another. And we also have the desire right from the beginning as human beings to engage responsively with other people. In fact, now anthropologists are saying we survived as a species because we have these abilities, because if a baby doesn't connect with an adult who will get invested in that baby's survival, the baby doesn't survive. So, really the question is not how do we find our voice? The question is really, so why do we lose our voice? Mm-hmm. And a lot of my work was really this discovery, which was astonishing to me. Which was the assumption that whole groups of people have no voice. and or that their voices don't matter. And, you know, boy, you can, I mean, that's the beginning of trouble. No, it really is. I mean, because if you, I mean, without a voice, you can't engage in relationships. So it's really, I think, I have a simple answer, Pat. Voice is the foundation. And when I said voice, I meant a voice. And my colleague in this scene at Harvard kept talking about the concept of voice and the metaphor of voice. And I kept saying, no, voice.
Yeah. And you also moved way beyond just the concept of a women's voice or a girl's voice to talk more recently about the human voice.
Well, you know, yeah, thank you for that question, because the whole trajectory of my work, which really began in the 1970s, where by sheer sort of accident of history, I found myself listening to women talking about a decision that they were making. I mean, in other words, speaking about something that they were really invested in. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a book called In a Different Voice, and it's really interesting to me because the word woman is not in my title. And my point in that book was bringing women's voices into what was called at the time the human conversation, which didn't include many women's voices,
right,
changes the voice of the conversation. So the whole trajectory, you know, what is this, 30-something years later? What I realized was at the time, in the 1970s, it was almost impossible to hear this different voice. What made the voice different was that it connected thought with emotion. I mean, you know, I don't know if you're hearing this, but, you know, in my mind was at the time women were said to be too emotional, meaning irrational, meaning they would connect thought with emotion and connecting the mind with the body and connecting the self, the I, with relationships. And so that could only be heard at that time as a woman's voice because so pervasive, so powerful was the gender binary that made emotion. You could all do this. What gender is reason? Masculine. What gender is emotion? You know, but if you actually stop and think about it, I mean, it's ridiculous to say that, you know, men don't feel and women don't think. It's like, why would anybody say that? But people do all the time.
Yeah.
So the gender binary, the thing is the trajectory is what I realized, what I came to realize, and the crucial work was with girls, is that the different voice is a human voice. And what that is the voice that joins reason with emotion, the mind with the body, the self with, and that the voice, what it differs from, and here comes the word that Pat warned you about. It differs from a patriarchal voice, which makes the gender split between masculine and feminine. And in a patriarchal culture, a human voice is a voice of resistance because it's an alternative to the violence and it breaks the silence that maintains the patriarchal order. So in a different voice is really about this, I mean, the human voice sounded different and was associated with women. Right. That was my point.
And there may be some among us who are thinking, so how does this relate directly to Acumen's work? And it does in such a significant way, which I'd love you to talk more about because it is in the way that voices were left out of the human conversation. The poor are being left out of all the systems in which they need the goods and services and all of the systems that shut them out. So why explain the patriarchal connection then to the work to alleviate poverty? It's a small question.
Well, to me, the brilliance of Acumen and the shift in the paradigm is the notion that you have to work through, basically you have to work through relationship. Mm-hmm. you know, and you have to start with a recognition that, you know, the poor people are humans and they have a voice. And so you work with the power paradigm is the power of relationship, really to transform. I mean, I do something, you know, called, my project currently at NYU is called radical listening. And I love the word radical because it means going to the root. You know, so you listen to where is this conversation coming from? Where is this person coming from? And so forth. And then radical in the sense of transformative. So if you want to solve a problem, I mean, I love the presentation of the solar, that the problem was seen as endemic. It was seen as insoluble. So how do you come up with a creative solution? And the idea is you have to bring everybody's voices in and then work through relationship.
And actually, Acumen begins that way, by radical listening.
Yeah.
By going into the communities and saying to the most vulnerable communities, what is it you need? What goods and services are necessary to improve your lives? So radical listening is really the beginning of disassembling the systems.
Exactly. So what is patriarchy? I mean, it's very simple. It's the word hierarchy means rule of priests. Hieros is Greek for priest. So it's an order, a kind of, hierarchy is a rule of priests, which means you don't have direct access to truth or knowledge or salvation or whatever. You have to go through some group that are the priests. So patriarchy, I mean, come on, it's obvious. Those people who have a voice, who have direct access to truth and power and knowledge are the fathers, the paters. They are the priests in a patriarchal system. That means that you elevate some men over other men and all men over women, and you privilege the voices of the fathers. They are, so you're actually depriving yourself of huge amounts of human resources in that situation. The opposite of patriarchy in my work is democracy, meaning it's based on equal voice. You know, and the idea is that everyone has a voice. And then you come in and you just don't even know what will come out of that mix of people working together to take on and solve a problem.
You know, Carol, when you say that, it makes such sense when you say patriarchy is the opposite of democracy. And yet how do we get past all the emotional concepts and context in which patriarchy tends to put blame on some, shame on others? It's just a very uncomfortable concept. So how do we connect it to this work?
Well, I mean, I think there are two really major discoveries. I mean, I'll tell you, first of all, the discovery of my own research came after I wrote In a Different Voice. I spent 10 years with my students to really listen to girls, to learn from girls. And I always, you know, I remember the Boston Globe, this is when I was at Harvard, and writing up, you know, Harvard professor is helping girls find their voices. I was working with 9 and 10-year-olds in the public schools of Cambridge. And they took this article from the Boston Globe, and they looked at me, and they looked at the article, and they said, we have our voices. And it was really interesting because what I learned was the investment of people in girls losing their voices. I mean, the amount of pressure placed on girls and the incentives, the inducements held out to them if they wouldn't say what they saw, if they wouldn't say what they were really feeling and thinking, if they wouldn't say what they knew from experience. Because the thing with patriarchy is its intention with human nature, because we are basically relational, responsive beings. I mean, this is born with a voice and with the desire to engage responsively with others. And boy, if you want to see this, just Google 2-minute still face experiment and see how a 1-year-old baby, and it can be a baby of any, you know, any gender, race, and blah, blah, blah. And the film shows this baby with a caretaker I mean, this you could go anywhere in the world, Sierra Leone, anywhere. And the parent, the caretaker, is told at a certain point to stop responding to the baby, make their face still. And instantly, I mean, in a nanosecond, the baby picks up the loss of connection and moves immediately to repeat what got a response, to try to heal, to repair the rupture in the relationship. Now, to my mind, if you want to set up a hierarchy and put one group of people as superior and another group of people as inferior, whether on the basis of race or gender or class or caste, you have to stunt these human relational capacities. I mean, you have to subvert our ability, our desire, our move, our really kind of inherent move to live in relationship, to repair the breaks in relationship. I mean, we all know this. In the course of a day, we move in and out of connection with ourselves and other people.
Right.
And our ability to maintain any relationship with ourselves or with one another depends on learning how to repair. When you lose connection, how do you find the other person again? Right. But if you have a social order that wants certain people to have a voice and everyone else to be as though they don't have a voice, then you have to interrupt that. So what I'm saying, and I find this very hopeful right now, is there's a basic tension between who we are as humans and the structure of patriarchy, which really stands in the way of finding creative solutions to endemic problems. That's all.
So love to hear more about the creative solutions as you see them addressing Acumen's vision and mission for the world, which is to stand with the poor, to listen, to bring dignity to all populations.
You know, it's interesting. I say to my students, it's interesting, because you say to bring dignity. And I start with the assumption, because I work with children, too, that everyone has a voice. So if someone is as if they don't have a voice, my question is always, where is their voice? You know, what happens to their voice? And part of dignity, or the word respect, which is, you know, right lives alongside it, is to, if I listen to you, if I have a question and I come to you, say we want to solve the problem of electricity, and I come to you and I say, well, you have experience that could be valuable. I'm treating you as a person of value, I mean, of respect and who has dignity. So, you know, and if you don't treat people with dignity, you shame them and you insult them. And we all know how that feels. You know, I mean, nothing good comes of that, nothing.
So what have you learned in this work, Carol, that we could take and translate directly into the field as we are bringing goods and services, and with that dignity to the lives of populations who are currently left out of so many of the hierarchical systems and without a voice?
Well, you know, okay, so partly I would just repeat what you already know. I mean, what it's part of Acumen, you know, which is obviously you bring, you know, you bring a listening ear. I mean, and an interest in what they know, because you don't know what they know. And then I've often been surprised at how little it can take to call forward a voice that has been basically held in silence or kind of, do you know what I mean? Or sort of held underground kind of thing.
Yeah.
And part of it is really to approach someone with a genuine interest in. But I've also learned something else, which may be, I think it speaks to, well, maybe to Acumen and where it started. The interesting thing about patriarchy, I mean, because it's easy to say, across the gender spectrum, we're all humans. But patriarchy is really a way of organizing human life that is based on gender. And patriarchy is much more interested in the boys than in the girls. And the girls are an afterthought until they reach adolescence, at which point their cooperation, their complicity, you might say, is essential. So that means I'm always interested in the girls in the community, you know, in the honest voices of pre-adolescent girls. And I think that because the women are initiated later, they often are extraordinary observers. And because they're more marginal within the patriarchal structure, they know things that you don't know. So I think...
And hope does lie with them, doesn't it? That's why I give your book to all my adolescent grandchildren.
But you know, the interesting thing is the big finding of the work with girls was the finding of resistance. That girls resist the initiation. It would cause them to lose basic human capacities. And after seeing that in girls, my question was, don't boys resist this as well? But I went to younger boys, 4 to 6 year olds, and their fathers. And so, you know, I now think in the emotional intelligence of little boys. You could see it in some of those films. It's really extraordinary.
Well, the hope is that we'll bring forward all these voices.
So my sense is, you know, I think women's voices are absolutely key to starting a conversation that I don't think happens if women aren't speaking. But it's not a women's conversation.
Right.
It's a human conversation.
So you said something very interesting earlier about your feeling hopeful.
Yeah.
And this is a time where many people aren't, feeling that the power paradigms are deeply entrenched and that it's hard. We know it's hard because it takes time to change a paradigm. Right. So what is the source of your hope and optimism about the fact that we can shift and transform the paradigms that are holding back and losing voice?
Oh, I think right now what we are, I mean, we're with warring paradigms right now. I mean, we really are with conflicting paradigms. They're both right out there, which is really interesting. The source of my hope is really first of all, there's been this huge paradigm shift in the human sciences. I mean, where I sit, I'm very aware of it, where there are books like The Age of Empathy, Why We Cooperate, Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding, that it used to be said that humans were kind of, you know, what was this? Nature raw and tooth and claw. I mean, competitive, aggressive, so forth. So the questions were, how do we gain the capacity to be empathetic? How do we overcome self-interest and selfishness? How do we learn to take the point of view of the other? How do we learn to engage in relationships? It's completely flipped now. It's completely flipped. The question is, how do we lose our capacity for empathy? How do we lose our desire to engage with others? How do we lose our ability to love? I mean, how do we become careless with ourselves and other people? And that's where all the trauma research comes in, because it says something has happened.
Right.
So that's very hopeful, because then it says these power paradigms, these power over paradigms are in tension with who we are as humans. So that's really helpful. The second thing is, as I said, my work with girls. So 10 years we spent listening to girls, and the big finding was resistance. And she was like, as a healthy body resists infection, so a healthy psyche resists the loss of voice and the loss of relationship, the loss of connection. You don't have to import something. You basically join this. It's like, you know, bringing good foods that build up the immune system of the body. You educate people on how do you repair ruptures in relationship? How do you deal with conflict and disagreement? You know, the thing about equal voice, which is democracy, as opposed to patriarchy, which is the voices of the fathers, if you don't have equal voice, we all know this from our intimate relationships and from our public relationships. Mm-hmm. In the absence of equal voice, you cannot deal with conflict in relationship. Mm-hmm. Conflicts get resolved by domination. So that means somebody's the winner and somebody's going away feeling resentful as the loser. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Right.
So equal voice is the condition for love and for democracy. It's the condition for dealing with voice and with conflict in relationship rather than by domination. So that's another source of hope. And my third source of hope, and I kept this is something I sort of stumbled into, which was, because it wasn't anything. It was the opposite of everything I had been taught as a psychologist, an interviewer, researcher. I'll tell you, it really started with girls. And I would ask a teenage girl a question, and sometimes I would get an answer that struck me as so banal. I think what's it called, a Valley Girl kind of answer. And I was thinking, I could go away as a psychologist and write about how girls don't know very much or don't think very, and instead of doing that, I would look at a girl and I would say, is that true? Or I would say, do you really feel that way? And I would get the word actually back. Mm-hmm. Girl said to me, I don't like myself enough to look out for myself. And I thought, that's really sad. I could have just scored her low self-esteem. So I said to her, do you really feel that way? She said, actually, this is how I look out for myself. Mm-hmm. By never saying what I'm really feeling and thinking. And then she said, that way, whatever anybody says about me, I don't care. They don't have no idea who I am. Mm. And then she looked at me and she said, brilliant, isn't it?
Well, what?
And I said, yes. I said, it's a brilliant strategy, but it's at the expense of what you said you wanted, which was honesty in relationship. Yeah. So that's where it got to radical listening. That also makes me hopeful, is underneath a conversation is another conversation. Underneath a patriarchal voice is a human voice. That really is the source, because if you listen for that voice and you can hear the difference.
Carol, you gave us a different way of thinking about our own voices, and now you've given us a different way of thinking of Acumen's work within this context of radical listening and empowering voices. Thank you very much for being with us.